Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here as we start our fall 2023 lecture series. We have a wonderful treat for you today. We have the very good luck and pleasure to have Dr. Salwa Al-Nouri here with us. She was a visiting Fulbright scholar last academic year, and we got to know each other a little bit then, and we're so grateful to have her back here with us today. We're going to try something new for those of you joining us online, which should be almost everybody, as we're launching our fall series this year with this recorded lecture to make sure that we have a little something to entice everybody as we go into it. So Professor Al-Nouri is an associate teaching professor at University of Washington, Bothell, with affiliations in many other places and has done postdocs here, there, and there. Her doctoral training is in neuroscience from the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, one of the world's foremost institutions in this field. So we're very excited to hear what she has to tell us today about this integration and this interdisciplinary cultural context with STEM and humanities, and how we can all start working a little bit more towards this joined way of learning and engaging in the world. So for those of us who are here in the room today, please give us a round of applause and welcome Salwa.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that. The pressure is on. I can't tell you how excited I am to give a presentation to such a diverse group of people. So I first of all had to decide what I was going to talk about, and then decided I won't talk very much about my research work per se, my scientific research work, rather about some of the more, maybe my greater passions, and that has to do with teaching and creating learning spaces. And so I tried to gear it a little bit so that it might entice everybody a little bit, but it really is going to be kind of just a discussion, and I'll go through and I'll tell you all about things. Feel free to stop me anytime, or if you like, we can hold things to the end. Up to you, or both. So I have been intrigued recently, maybe the last 7 or 8 years recent, with this idea of being a polymath, or having my students think about things as polymaths might. And so we'll talk about what a polymath is and what it could be in a minute. But this idea of coming into and thinking about what you're learning from multiple perspectives. So for me, to give a student something in science and biology and have a historian or a philosopher or an archaeologist tell and inform them what they're learning means to me that it's going to go to a much higher level of learning than it would otherwise. So the title today, Reviving Polymathy in Contemporary Education, Integration of Interdisciplinary and Cultural Contexts to Enhance Science, Technology, Engineering, and Maths, or rather STEM curricula. So what I'm going to do, so I'll give some context for why I am doing the work that I'm doing. I'll talk a little bit about my research, just a spattering of what I'm doing, and then focus a lot more on the teaching component and why the interdisciplinary comes into it. So as in the introduction, I'm a neuroscientist by training. I teach neuroscience courses, biology, physiology, health-related courses. I also have a degree in history and philosophy of science, which I got because I was interested. I worked very hard to get that degree from the University of Pittsburgh, and I really loved studying the content. And then as soon as I got into the sciences, I never got to visit that content again. So that was the first red flag for me. We are lacking something in STEM education that we don't, that we don't use, and that is history and philosophy of science. So that's, I guess, what I would start by saying. And then this idea of integrating science and research and teaching and bringing in multiple disciplines, and then finding places of intersection that are unique, that are different from anything else, that allows students to think beyond and above what is right there in front of them. And so as Aristotle says, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so I'll come back to that. So it's just me giving a bit of context. And so then this has allowed me to think a little bit more about pedagogy. And so I use that word all the time, and sometimes people ask me, what exactly is pedagogy? So the dictionary definition, it's the art, science, or profession of teaching. And I really will come back and say that, yes, teaching is both an art and a science. And how we can do this well requires that we think about that in those terms. But it also includes the method and practice of teaching. So typically, I don't stand at the front of the room and lecture like I'm doing right now. By now, I would have given you at least 2 activities to have completed so that you're actually thinking about what what's being presented to you and holding it and manipulating it. But that brings me back to being able to incorporate into teaching practice this idea of being a polymath and how learners can be a polymath. And again, I don't put students because I actually think that on most days, I learn a lot more than my students do. I learn from what they're telling me, how they respond to me. So the learning space is this collaborative space between the student and the teacher. And the teacher can be a student, the teacher can be a community member, the teacher can be so many other definitions as well. And so this idea of the polymath is being able to support and draw on other bodies of knowledge than the one that's being put in front of them, right? So they can integrate it and develop it to higher levels of learning. And then my other area of interest that overlaps with this actually is internationalization of the classroom, internationalization of the curriculum, and bringing in cultural context and globalized perspectives into the classroom as well. So today what I'm going to end up doing is actually share with you a little bit of my Fulbright work, which was actually the proposal was focused on culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive learning. So the Fulbright that I conducted was at the Hashemite University, and I taught functional anatomy, and I taught master's students Introduction to Neuropharmacology. My interests, though, was in the culturally responsive teaching component, and that's what I'll come back and talk about. So before moving on, we've got a little picture down at the bottom of this screen. So I teach at the University of Washington, and I do research on the Seattle campus and teach there, but this is our other campus. It's a tri-campus system, and this is the Bothell campus, where my primary appointment is. And I've included that picture there. That was actually during COVID, and you can see there was nobody there, right? So I needed to pull another one. But now that we're back in person, the University of Washington Bothell is a very diverse student body. And so it was probably the trigger for me, the main idea of why do I need to introduce culturally responsive teaching in the classroom? And many of our students hail from this region, from the Middle East and North Africa. And so I have students that come into the classroom, and I want to make sure that the classroom is optimized for their learning, right? And as opposed to just standing up there and delivering a lecture, they could go home, see a recorded version of, open a textbook, Google. That's not helpful. So this was where this I think impetus came for me. All right, so I kind of just said this, but I'll come back. So the relevance and significance for me for this work was this observation that at least at the university level, we were finding that people that teach science, like myself, we really have a very narrow perspective and presentation of the content that we give, right? So we don't really integrate very many interdisciplinary perspectives. Textbooks come, they just focus very much on, some foundational concept, and that's it. And we don't see any integration with any other disciplines outside maybe the very readily associated ones, and definitely not with humanities. So what you end up with is a student that gets content and really can't peg it into a bigger framework. Why is that important at a global level? Why is this important even? So they learn the content, and even a month later, you could ask them the content and they don't remember it, because there's really no application of it at higher levels. There's no synthesis creation. And these words refer to what's known as Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And these are things that allow people to develop their learning to higher levels. And it's just not, we're just not doing it. So this was my observation and the relevance of it. And we talk about this as faculty all the time. So being that I'm very practical, I thought, what can I do in my classrooms to find a way to integrate other perspectives into the learning space? And so I'm going to describe today some of that, and then I'm going to come back and invite all of you to think about this with me, because it is extremely helpful when we think about teaching and learning spaces from a community-based connected learning perspective. What can everybody here can help teach, right? Everybody here learns every day, but how can we teach together? So the approach that I'm going to be talking about is going to be one that draws on interdisciplinary exploration and also bringing in cultural, historical, and philosophical context. I don't have time to describe all of the work that I've done, but I do collaborate routinely with linguists and with artists in teaching science. And at the end of the course, I get feedback from students, and I can see how much that has helped to develop their teaching, their learning. And then, like I said, this idea of community engagement and connected learning. So again, if I go typically on campus and talk about community engagement, we think local community. But in fact, when we think about community, we should be thinking global as well. We're all part of this global community. And so I've been doing some work with internationalization and globalization, and I'll describe some of those approaches as well. One of them being the one over here. I'm not used to standing at the podium. Collaborative Online International Learning, or COIL. And this is a form of virtual exchange. And I've done some teaching in virtual space that employs this pedagogy and this tool with universities in the MENA region, including with the Hashemiyya. I'm not going to describe that work today, but certainly feel free at the end if you're interested to learn more about that. And it is connected learning. Okay. So questions and answers, we'll come back to that. All right. So if I were to have you open a biology textbook, the more traditional biology textbooks, or a physics textbook, or even a chemistry textbook, you may, on a good day, if you're lucky, get some ancient Greek content, something, maybe because some of the words might derive from Latin or things like that, but you might, and then they can go back and find some other roots are from Greek, but you wouldn't really get that much in terms of anything else. You just come in and you start learning about whatever concept that you're supposed to be learning about. And so, but this is the traditional. You'll come in and you may hear about the ancient and Hellenistic Greek contributions to science. I'm not a historian, so I'm not going. I'm just showing this as an example of what it is. And so here you can, on the map, you can see the region that we are talking about. And if I can get that pointer to do it, we're talking about this region over here, all of this. But that's it. That's pretty much what you'll get, unless you're lucky enough to be in a room with somebody who really does value this polymath perspective. Other than that, you just learn the science and you go on. So I pulled this off the internet while I was preparing, and this idea of Hellenic versus Hellenistic. And it wasn't really because of the definitions so much. It was because this table broke things down into the time periods, right? And then into the contributions in philosophy and literature and art and science and religion. And again, if you take a look, of course, because these are Hellenic and Hellenistic, you can see, of course, some of the most prominent names that have made some huge contributions to science. And you're probably familiar with many of them. One of the activities that I would have done, if we were doing a workshop or an interactive thing, I would have given you this table, taken that out, and plugged in something else instead of Hellenic and Hellenistic, and asked you to generate for me how many scientists or philosophers or artists or anybody theologians that you could recognize from another culture, be it from China, be it from India, be it from the Islamic Golden Age. And I would say that you would have a harder time doing that. Maybe because we're in the MENA region here, we're in the Middle East, you might be able to do it. But But this is, and maybe because all of you have a history and archaeology background, but if I were to substitute everybody here and have them be scientists, I could probably tell you that most people can't reproduce a table like this. And so that tells me that, again, we're only giving a very limited perspective, right? We're not really allowing students to see things. And science scaffolds on and builds on previous knowledge. So if you can't see that progress, you're not really seeing the actual science happening. You're just learning a fact or a concept, but you're not seeing how that development happens. And so you're missing out on one of the most important things, and that is the process of science, right? And how today I tell my students, I have them read historical papers from 100 years ago. I tell them in 100 years, if you're all still here, and you read a paper, if they read our papers, they probably look at them and think, what were they thinking? What was that thing called a cell phone? You know, what was, I mean, we won't even go into artificial intelligence and ChatGPT right now. It's a nightmare. But what are we going to be thinking? I mean, ChatGPT is, but for teachers. But the fact is, they need to see where they fall in this continuum of science and science progress. Okay, so again, pulled this from the internet, and here you can see we've got a timeline. And like I said, we were looking that table. We were looking probably in this region around here, and then I have this is like one of those things that you can see at a library or in the airport. You are here when you're looking to find where you're at, and this is where we are, right, on this timeline. But what happened to everything in between? Did the world just stop still and that was it? Nobody contributed, nobody did anything. This is one of the problems I have when I go into a classroom that teaches about science and doesn't really give that perspective, right? So in some of my courses, I've been trying to do this. And today I'll talk to you about this period that I've focused on, the Islamic Golden Age. But that's not to say that there wasn't science going on all in parallel fashion in different regions of the world. And in fact, one of the tasks that, again, would have been the activity number 2 for all of you would have been to pick a culture, a civilization, a region of the world to be able to then come in and tell me something about. Research it, come in and let me know about. So this is one I'm going to focus on, this one, because of where we are and because it was one of my favorite activities and I was interested in it. Right, so we're going to expand the discussion. This is what we wanted to do. All right, and so now we came in, we shifted a little bit. I love maps. We shifted a little bit, right? And so, yes, we were looking over here a little bit more. Now we're coming over here. This is where we all are right now physically, right? But this, I pulled this. And again, I wanted the students to be thinking, whatever period of time or region they had thought about, to think about what was going on in that region at the time. What were the factors that influenced this? What was the religion or the political or economic, any of those things that influenced this, right? So in this idea, as I have stated here, there was different abstract thinking occurring in all of these different regions, right? And these were important achievements to applied science, and they occurred independently. Sometimes there was some dynamic intersection, especially if there was migration reasons, right? And you all would know more about this than I would, but certainly there was work from this region in Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, China, all of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about the course design, one of my course designs. And so the idea was to have us do this. I wanted students to think about not only what they were learning, but to choose what they were learning, have it be relevant to them. So they had the students all sitting around at a table, like you can see. And I went in the first day of this is one of the courses, and this was a biology class. Whoops, I want me to be recording. A biology class that was open to non-majors as well as majors. It ended up filling with majors, so I didn't really get the non-majors that I wanted because I wanted their perspectives. But I went in the first day of class, gave them, you're probably all familiar with the syllabus. And I said, here, this is the syllabus. What I'd really like you to do is rewrite the syllabus. Take out what I've put in. I've got everything, all the materials ready for the syllabus, but I want you to tell me what you want to learn about. Of course, it would be vetted by me to make sure that they were learning the stuff that they needed to learn, but they got to do it. So it was student-led learning. Now the focus, the responsibility is on the student to learn. It was active because not only was it discussion, they had to do research. And that was another thing. Research, if you go into a science classroom and you use the word research, it's almost that science has a proprietary ownership of the word. They don't think of research as being something that's done in the humanities. Research is only a scientific endeavor. And so to be able to break down some of those things, to try and develop this idea that really hardcore, important research is done in the humanities was something that was very striking to me that students didn't appreciate so much. But they certainly had to develop critical thinking skills, research skills, and not just be given things. So the active learning came out through there. Collaborative learning, and the collaborations were with each other, but they were also with the community. It was with museums, it was with other private institutions, and in fact, it was with students across the world. So we did this COIL collaboration. The first COIL collaboration, that I'll tell you about, was with a university in Iraq. I had never met the faculty member over there or their students. I'd been introduced to them by one of my colleagues at the University of Washington who had done something similar with them. And the idea is we take our students, 2 cohorts, and we meet synchronously as well as asynchronously in virtual space, and we learn from each other. Now, the first time I did it, it was an upper-level neuroscience course. It was neuropharmacology, and it was with linguist students who have no idea about pharmacology. And to say it to be equitable, most of my students knew nothing about linguistics. They might know languages, but they don't really know so much about linguistics. And so it was, how can these 2 rather disparate disciplines come together to inform the teaching and learning space? All right, so these were some of the things. Let's take a look. Again, I'm going to share with you some of the course learning objectives just to think about what we had hoped the students were getting. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. It's not so, but then I'll come back and focus on the cultural component. So we wanted students to develop an understanding of the historical and philosophical aspects of science. Even more so, it was, why is it important? Well, why should we bother with this? Most students, especially those that are doing an undergraduate degree to go into graduate school, say in medicine or in dentistry, they're like, why am I wasting my time on this? Why do I have to know about this? It's only at the very end that they come back, and when you ask them to reflect or to give you feedback, that they say, this was one of the most enriching and eye-opening experiences. But going into it, they're like, why do I need to know about that? I just need to know what I need to do to get my grade and to move on, right? It's not very rewarding, actually, right? But it allowed them to explore the emergence of the scientific method. Now, you take any student of science and you tell them, describe to me or tell me about the scientific method, and they're not really that good at telling you about it. It's just something that they think they're doing, but they're not necessarily as explicit or reflective about what that was or is. And so, again, it's informed by this. And then to make it fun and to kind of open people's eyes, I selected some very high impact scientific experiments to show how they have contributed to science today. And I'll describe in a minute, for example, some work by Ibn al-Haytham, and we'll come back and I'll tell you a little bit about him in a minute. And then they're tasked to consider theories, frameworks, paradigms, and then to think about things that, again, scientists think they're the only people that do this, and that is think about evidence-based reasoning, thinking about inductive and deductive thinking. And again, scientists really do think they're the only people that do this, but there you have it. Come back, think about cultural aspects, think about what are the challenges And again, this is an easy question for people to be thinking about in some ways. When I tell them, think about technical, political, ethical, social, economic challenges to what you're doing. And so we're in COVID, and I'm like, what are some of the problems we've got? I mean, we've got a vaccine. What were some of the issues with developing the vaccine? What's some of the issues of getting the vaccine to people? What's the issue about being able to convince people to take that vaccine, right? This is all part of this context of science. And then to engage in the discussion. And I think I kind of showed that as well as the science communication together, because that's what I'll be spending most of my next slides on. So I'll come back to that. All right, so here, another map. And I went in and I said, well, let's focus on the Islamic Golden Age. And what I want you to see is that the contributors to this were from all over the world, right? And guess what? The language of this was not English. It's the lingua franca today, but at that time, the lingua franca was Arabic. Although people might have been doing their research or their work in different parts, there was a big movement for translation of these works and bringing these works together. So the students basically were tasked to find any scientist that was doing work related to any of the scientific concepts that we were learning in the class, be it the cardiovascular system, or be it the visual system, or be it whatever. And so they did the adopt a scientist, or preferably adopt a polymath approach. Find somebody and do the research. So that is exactly what they did. So I started. I said, I'll model this. I'll do the first one, and then you can do another one. And so for me, I picked Abu Ali al-Hassan bin al-Hassan ibn al-Haytham, right? Al-Hazan in the Latinized name. So he was born in Basra, present-day Iraq. So this is the content that I gave the students. Not a lot. They go and they have to do the research. So I give them some frameworks, right? I give them the year, tell them where he died, and then I tell them that he was an Arab polymath of the Islamic Golden Age. And guess what? He was a mathematician, an astronomer, a physicist. He wrote on philosophy, he wrote on theology, and he wrote on medicine. All of a sudden, they're thinking, wow, so he's all of these things, or he was all of these things, right? And he is referred to as the father of modern optics. And he had some significant, highly significant contributions to optics as we know it today, right? And into the idea of the visual system and visual perception. And in fact, it was just a few years before I was teaching this course that the United Nations, they had the UNESCO commemoration, and it was the 2015 International Year of Light that celebrated the 1000th anniversary of the work on optics by Ibn Haytham. So the students were set up with this, and then they had to go work on it. And they had to come back and relate it to something that they were learning about in class and that they were interested in learning about. And what does it, and I'm just going to do this because I teach rather than lecture. What do you think were the biggest challenges to this? Any ideas?
Having access to the actual things he wrote.
Having access, right? But we're like, we've got access to everything on our telephone. I've just been, you make all of you, anything that you need, you pick up your phone and you can do it. But having access to that content, the translated and the non-translated, was very, very difficult. And so I ended up reaching out to colleagues around the world, and I did get some of these, and I'll show you them in a minute. But this was actually the biggest challenge. All right, so his most influential work, Kitab al-Manadhir, had survived in a Latin edition. And I'd actually been able to get some things from there for the students to look at. I was also able to get them some of the original text, the Arabic text, right? So now let's go back. I'm at the University of Washington, Bothell. How many students in my class do you think speak Arabic? Is that what you thought? Don't use the percent makes it hard because I've had different. Yes, okay, that we're getting.
Makes the class.
So that was the question. I capped the class. That was it. I capped the class because I had half of the students were mine, and half of the students were from the university in Iraq, right? So in virtual space, it doubles all of a sudden. So if I had 20 students and they had 20 students, they had 40 students. I asked the question, maybe I needed to give a little bit more detail. How many, no, I think I did say it. How many students from the University of Washington spoke Arabic? And I think there was about three to four of those students spoke Arabic in the class. That was their ethnic background, right? How well they could read Arabic was another story. That was another thing as well. And one of the most interesting things happened is when we gave the work, both the translated and the original, we gave both options and access, and the linguist students in Iraq were used to studying in English, but they all got to work together in groups and look at the Arabic as well as the English text. They unanimously decided that the English was far easier to understand than the Arabic because of the time. It was a different time, right? So we're thinking, so it gets the students to think about this. It's not just the language, it's the time that changes and what the context of these words were. Anyway, I'll come back and tell you a little bit more about that, and I'll show you what we did. But here we highlight the two things that we wanted them to think about, and that was that he explained that vision occurs when light's reflected from an object and passes into one's eyes, and that he had demonstrated that vision occurs in the brain rather than in the eyes. Now, these students that I'm talking about, my students, have all come into the laboratory, have dissected actual eyes, have seen all of that, and they think they know all about the visual system. And I'm like, well, do you think that they hadn't dissected those eyes back then? And they had dissected eyes back then. So it was really some interesting things that came out of that. He's also credited with looking at El Bayt al-Mudlim, or what we know from the translation today as the camera obscura. So again, now we're coming back to the physics component of things. So the students are being challenged to be thinking about this and integrate it together. So we give them a little bit, have them think about that. And then finally, we have them think about the fact that Ibn al-Haytham was an early pioneer of the scientific method. And in fact, describes he's one of the earliest proponents of this concept that you need to have a hypothesis and that it's supported by experimentation and the findings from that. Again, scientists think that only they hypothesize, that other fields and disciplines don't hypothesize and don't generate data and think about whether or not. And so this was really good for them to kind of be thinking about that. And so this quotation here, the duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. So this again brought up this idea of critical thinking, and then to think about bias in perception. And guess what? They're in this shared space, and they had so much discussion on what kind of bias and stereotyping could be happening. So the growth was happening on so many levels. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this again. I already showed you that, and I've told you about what COIL is, but COIL had some specific learning outcomes. We needed the students to develop a globalized perspective. We wanted them to think about things in interdisciplinary lenses. We wanted them to be thinking about culturality, intercultural awareness, and engagement. We wanted them to think about the role that language plays, how important it is for us to be able to communicate, but how also language and having a lingua franca imposes bias in certain spaces, in many spaces. And there's a power bias, right? The people that speak English versus the people that speak English as a second language versus people that speak other languages. And in fact, we had students in the class that discussed things like when regions of the world that used French or used other languages as a lingua franca, how did that come into this? And then the idea that we can think about dialogic space. I'm actually not going to go into that. That was more my linguist partner's field. But this is what I wanted to show you. We ended up pulling from Ibn al-Haytham's work. I selected these two images. And of course, this was after I'd reached out to a bunch of people to get these. And here you can see these are this is the actual writing in his book. And so here, for those of you that might be wondering what this is, there's two eyeballs, the nerves, as I'm a neuroscientist, that come out of the eyes, cross in this region called the optic chiasm, and then they go back to the brain. Okay, and here's the translation. In science, I would say probably within the last decade or so, many scientific journals are now looking for, rather than giving big, lengthy bits of text, they want what's called the graphical abstract. This is exactly what that is. It's a graphical abstract from 1,000 years ago, and it's there in English and there in Arabic. And so the students were asked to work on this. And what do you understand? And then to compare it with what we know today. Again, a question for all of you that might not be used to looking at dissections of the eye. How similar do you think this is to what we know of the brain today and the eyes and the visual system? Does it need to be similar first? And is it similar at all? Mm-hmm. 30%? 40? I like these numbers, okay? All right, what else? Okay, so let's take a look. Everybody remembered this? This is before. Just upside down, but what do you think? Very similar. And in fact, if you go in and you look, this for them, I think, was that aha epiphany moment when from a current textbook, this is actually one of the ones that I use in a lab dissection, I tell them to come in and dissect it. If one of those linguist students had picked up that Arabic thing, they could have probably figured out so much information. It's really powerful, actually, to see this. Okay, so all right, so some of the objectives, and again, I'm wrapping this bit up. I just kind of wanted to set the stage maybe a bit more deeply than I planned with why and how some of the tools that we can use in learning spaces can be helpful in doing these things. So enhancing teaching effectiveness, right? The students absolutely had spent a week working with their peers in another country, in another continent, in virtual space, which technically has less bias because it's not that you're like an international student on campus in another country, but you're in this virtual space that everybody owns. And we develop a safe space for people to be able to talk and to discuss. But it was really for them this moment that they'd spent all this time, and I could hear my biology students saying, it's just like what we know. And I'm thinking, yeah, do you understand how important the historical contribution was, right? But then developing an understanding of the challenges. Well, one of them being access. How can we have access to this? How can we highlight and emphasize work that's being done across the world, not just here, but across the world that we don't have access to, either because it's not available or because of political restrictions or because of language barriers as well, right? And then the idea, I already talked about the historical bit, but this idea of science dissemination. And that was something that was done amazingly well in the Islamic Golden Age because they would send people far and wide to bring back knowledge, right? And then they did a huge amount of translation and sharing of that work. And so how are we doing that today? Yes, we have an internet, and I could rediscuss some of the current issues. And so people were talking about, well, countries in the world that don't have access, the money to pay for expensive scientific journals, publishing in open access journals is very costly. They started discussing these issues, right? So these were things that they mentioned. And then putting the observations together from some of the feedback that we got was that they really appreciated having the historical and cultural contexts provided to them and to their learning. Okay, so that's a little bit about COIL, and I've included that, the Collaborative Online International Learning, and I've said some of the things that can emerge from it, as we've just mentioned. And I do want, as an academic, to bring this up, but really in the spirit of community and of community learning, this idea of open pedagogy and being able to have innovation and creativity, sharing of ideas, very much like we're doing right now, a connected community, something again ACORE is doing, learner generated, right? Having the students think, all of us that come here and are doing the research that we're doing, we're learner generated. We're extracting this information and then sharing it, right? Reflective practice. It's amazing to me how many students will come back and tell me, I remember that course really well. I even remember the diagrams and the drawings, and they reflect back. And I think that's really helpful. So just some of that for context. Okay, so I've got all these stars that are coming. But this brings me then to the community-based and connected learning. So here I am in Amman, and I'm teaching at Hashimi, and I have a colleague, a good, really amazing mentor and colleague in England, Dr. Salim Al-Hassani, and he tells me about this exhibit, the 1001 Inventions, and it's currently there at the museum. It's Alf Ikhtira' wa Ikhtira'. Highly encourage you all to go take a look at it if you can. It's a very interactive exhibit. All right, and so here I am at Al-Hashimiya. We're doing functional anatomy, from dissections to discussions. And then I go and I talk to them, to some of the faculty over there, and we arrange a tour for the students to go to the museum. So it was a really exciting, so here it is, that's the line downtown, and then you go from there, you go to West al-Balad, and you have some really good treats and foods and stuff to do. But it's an amazing exhibit. So you go into the museum, second floor, right? And again, looking at the history and context of during that. So here we are. Here are some of my students. It was right after things were kind of there. Everybody was back in session again. COVID issues still there, but I actually contracted COVID. But people were doing things and moving, and so they hadn't been on a field trip for a very long time. So then we go on a field trip. And the framework was to explore some of the similarities and differences from what they were learning in their current content with the historical content. For me, it was to look at some of some of my Fulbright work, to look at some of the differences in pedagogy and teaching and approaches to educational frameworks at the University of Washington and the Hashimiyya. So here we go. And you can see the students. This is the exhibit, very interactive. And there is, in fact, this was a collaboration between the Royal Scientific Society in the UK and the Jordan Museum. And they it's really beautifully done. And there's a teacher's pack, and there's an award-winning film. And all of this because there are lots of people, like-minded people like me, that think that we really need to be able to peg science that we're teaching to history. And so the students, again, I'm not going to go through too much of this, but here they are. They had a great time. And then we came back to this graphical abstract. So they thought that they'd had a field trip, and that was it. They didn't realize that when they got back, I'd give them tons of work to do on that field trip. And so they did. And so they did. And I said, you know, why don't we do this? Why don't we do extra credit? Guess what? Extra credit. Everybody wants extra credit, right? So again, you work with what you've got and what you know, and that's like currency with a student, money. So I said, you know, I'll give you extra credit if you generate an graphical abstract, very much like Ibn al-Haytham's, right? Using what you know about current science, not historical, right? I'm going to strip away your ability to use too much language, too much English, too much Arabic. Really be creative, try and show me. But the part that you really need to do is then, and again, it was to encourage them to use English, is write a little synopsis on one of the scientists and their that you saw at the exhibit and their historical contribution. So it was two-edged. One, no words, and one, write some English, right? So here's one of them. This was, we had studied Alzheimer's disease, a nervous system disease. We did a very good job. And then they wrote about Al-Razi and his contributions to neuroscience. And they had to do some research and include that. And then students could be using those as resources to go and to learn more. Another one, this was on keratitis in the eye. Again, they've described some of the problems, some of the, what causes it, the bacteria, the fungus, and all of that. Not the interesting part. The interesting part was looking at the historical component and what they saw in the museum or in other works that were mentioned there that was related to that. And then they gave their resources. Another example, these are looking at that. This was the sensory system and looking at the ear and the ear canal and all of that. They did a great job learning all the science. So they knew that. And then they wrote about some of the works that were, some of the approaches that were done to treat, that were used during the Islamic Golden Period and treatments of the eye. This one, in fact, had talked about Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and Az-Zahrawi, but the students were very interested. One of the things that really came out to me, and it was more the teacher in me, was something like this. As they wrote, and the English isn't perfect, but their confidence and pride came out with something like our ancestors. Now you knew they were interacting with this content in a different way. There was some kind of connection with it that they were building. And this to me was extremely important. And so here then I had a student and she was doing kind of like an intern with the, with the Abdul Hamid Shoman Foundation. And so they sponsored a little poster exhibit. So here they had their posters up and people from the community came in, didn't have to be the biology department, could have been anybody, family even, and they came in and they saw it. So that brings us back to this idea of connected learning and community outreach, what we can all be doing to help. And it's not just, obviously, and this is a specific context, we can be doing it in anything that we want to be establishing these connections. And so here they were, again, very pleased with it. So I don't know why I have doubles of these. I think it just happened. So yes, did it inform my practice of teaching? It absolutely did. It showed me that we can do student-led learning in ways when I go in and tell them, design the course with my help, but collaborate with me, right? But be active. Don't just sit behind your Zoom screen, turn off your camera and think that you're going to be learning, because that's not helping, right? Or even coming to class and not engaging. And then the collaborative component is the one that I'm kind of pitching to all of you here, because I think regardless of whether it's with an academic institution or a research institute or a nonprofit or whatever it might be, that we can and have the ability to take some of this learning in all fields to other levels. Providing research opportunities and sites and locations to do that, so important. Have it be interdisciplinary and have us share it. I say science communication, but it's all kinds of communication that might happen. Okay, so I think I talk before I show the slide. So I've said all of this, and I'm going to wrap up. I do encourage you all to think about the institutional level, wherever you might be, and how you might be able to bring in contexts that support your learning. So implementation, faculty, staff training, things like that. And then this idea of connected and community learning, right? Why is it relevant? Yes, there are some things that students will kind of be puzzled by. Why is it important for me to learn that? Sometimes it's a great model system. Sometimes it really is just to be able to show them that things are all interconnected and build on each other. So I'm going to skip because I know that we're short of time, and I want to give at least a few minutes at the end to have people ask questions. But I'm going to probably have you all think about, this would have been a really great activity, to think about partnerships that you can develop in your own fields to help with your own work in whatever way, and to make it more visible and transparent and shared and communal, be it within your discipline or interdisciplinary with others as well. Okay, so I won't talk about this. I didn't get the chance to talk about some efforts that engage, that help support refugee communities. I'm happy to talk about that to anybody that's interested. And these are some of my collaborators, because it does take a village, a big world village, to do this. So I really want to thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope I didn't bore people. It's interesting to me. I'm just hoping that maybe at least many of you have children going into college, and hopefully you'll think about what they're learning as well. So thank you very much.
We're only going to take a couple of questions for the folks who are online, and then we'll turn it off and have a little bit more
Absolutely,
colloquial here.
absolutely.
It's hard to engage that way. I'm going to take advantage of my position in front of the camera
Yeah,
and ask the first question.
go for it.
It's a counter question. We very rarely in science or humanities or any other field of engagement publish our null results. What didn't work? What doesn't work in this regard? Because why should we try it again? And how do we find out what doesn't work when we're trying to engage these two spheres of thought together?
It's a great question. We ask that all the time. Students ask for this all the time. They go in to do a research project, and one of their mentors might say to them, "Oh, that's been done. I wouldn't go down that route because it doesn't work."
But tell me about it, and then
Yeah.
you never can.
And you never can. And I think it's because we only look at successes and we don't value what we learn from doing things that don't show as well. And I think it goes both ways. Absolutely.
One day someone is going to invent a journal of null results.
Yeah.
Just people will say this
Yeah.
didn't work, this didn't work, this didn't work.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
okay.
Other questions or
now all this information and technical challenges, accessibility, things like that, I would say, like, this world is full of potential scientists, successful people that could leave excellent mark and films for work and be of great contribution. However, one of the challenges is like when many of the people nowadays, because of the war zone and economic problems, they come from poverty background and we have refugees. So how can we be able to basically like for the family, be able to expose these people to opportunities, or at least part of the opportunities that other more fortunate people are being able to access? And
that is an excellent.
Let me repeat it for online really quick.
Please.
The basic question is how do we know if we don't know? Whatever community you're in, how do you understand things if you don't already know about it or know how to get access to it?
Yes, and then that little focus there that makes me gravitate to the question is the refugee component. So yes, war's done all kinds of things. Really good science is being done in all of these different parts of the world. And all of a sudden, the scientists sitting in their lab, doing their thing under their microscope, doing it suddenly displaced. Right? They've left behind all that science. And now they're in a community that there's a lot of, for people that have invested their lives doing things, it's kind of a desperate situation. And there are lots of scientists the world over, maybe not enough, but we are thinking about how can we make spaces for these people to come and still do their science, continue it so that it's not wasted time. But again, it's not the same as when they were doing it in their native. So you're absolutely right. And there are organizations around the world, in fact, that are working on it. The other question then becomes, what about these students that reach high school age? They're done with high school and now they want to go to college, but they're refugees and it's prohibitive. They don't have the money to go in and get that. And so again, can we use, and this is one of the things I was going to talk about. I'm happy to partner with anybody when we're thinking about doing these. Can we use virtual exchange that doesn't cost to give some kind of certification, digital badging, skills-based anything to students that then they can go on and there's some models, just for the grant to run again because of time, that can be self-sustained. How can they go about getting some kind of either the professional recognition for their work and being able to use it, and then the student having the hope that they might have had in their country, they're going to go to dental school, medical school, engineering, archaeology, history, and now they can't. How can we give them something that they might be able to use? Great. All of us can do it.
Well, I will stop us there for the purposes of online. Thank you again
Thank
so
you
much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us online.